Hey everyone, and welcome to Fig 1. Today we're going to talk about cults, specifically why they seem to thrive here in America. And for those of us not in cults, why are we so obsessed with them? If you flip through any streaming platform lately, you've probably seen that there's an endless supply of cult documentaries and podcasts. And as these stories become more mainstream, people are asking, what actually is a cult?
We're gonna talk about SoulCycle. This group sounds like a cult, but is it really?
I've consumed a lot of this media over the years, and so many of their storylines follow the same true crime formula. There's usually drugs, abuse, and always some charismatic but corrupt leader. But I always have one thought while I'm watching. How could anyone fall for this? The scam seems so obvious. But what if I told you that this misses something fundamental about cults and why people join them?
Nobody joins a cult. They join a good thing.
Professor Poulomi Saha has never been in a cult, but they've been studying their rise in our popular culture for years. It'd be easy to think that we're consuming all this cult media because it's so salacious, that some algorithm keeps telling TV studios to make more and more. But Poulomi thinks it's something else, and they predict that cults are going to become much more popular, not on Netflix, but in real life.
Thanks so much. I'm really delighted to be here and to talk to you about our cult obsession and the ways in which it's radically changing society. So here's my first question to you. How do we go from this to this?
What would it take you to join a cult? Because for me, I don't think it would be very much. I went to Catholic school and I was in a frat in college, so you know.
That TikTok video actually garnered thousands of responses of people who identified the most unbelievably mundane, sometimes as small as snacks, object or thing that would get them to join a cult. Many of them actually said, really, if you think about it, I'm already in a cult. That we will, in about 60 years, move from cults as an object of terror and social repression to a place where thousands are willing to avow what it would take for them to join a cult, and tens of millions of people tune in to watch and learn about cults is remarkable. And part of what I am particularly interested in my research and in my teaching is trying to understand, of course, why we're fascinated by cults, what's driving this obsession that we seem to have, and why it is we're so uninterested in being talked out of our obsession with cults. The question of what we are missing in our daily lives that cults offer us so thoroughly is actually the matter of longing for, I think, tens of millions of Americans. People join cults for all sorts of reasons, some profoundly familiar to us, to find belonging and meaning more consummate than they could imagine elsewhere, to have structure, to know God, to simply be taken out of their normal everyday lives. The truth is that when we agree to live within the strict confines of what we think of as the normative, it's almost unbearable for us to see people living beyond our psychic means, doing things that we didn't know it was possible to do, acting in ways that we were sure would be catastrophic. Part of why we watch cults is to see the ways in which people act out desires that we ourselves cannot fully feel or enact in our own lives. So to understand this phenomenon, I think we need to think about where we started, what a cult is, what a cult has become, and how we've changed along the way. So let's start, as a good English professor always should, with definitions. What is a cult? Well, if you ask the Oxford English Dictionary, it will tell you that a cult is a particular form or system of religious worship or veneration, especially as expressed in a ceremony or ritual directed towards a specified figure or object. It comes from the same first Latin and then French roots for care, labor, cultivation, and culture. But when we use the word cult in our everyday lexicon, that is clearly not what we mean. a system of veneration for someone like, say, Jesus or the Buddha is not what we mean when we think we're going to tune in for 12 episodes and do a deep dive. What we mean are UFO believers and doomsday messiahs, sex communes, and yoga scandals. Our sense of cult is not just a word from a dictionary, but it is in fact an entire narrative structure that describes a group or community that makes us realize what the limits of social approval are and what is exactly outside those limits. We might think of cults usefully in relation to what they're often not, that is, religion. Religion, again, quite blandly, according to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, is a taxon or a taxonomy for a set of social practices, of which the paradigmatic examples are what we think of as the world religions: Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, Confucianism, Taoism. It's a way that we give names to socially recognized and accepted practices and beliefs. That is, religion is a matter of the story we tell about it. That when we say, we understand that your rituals are oriented to a thing that you see as God, we are saying that we have a social appreciation for what you do. When we say your rituals are directed towards a con man or an absent fantasy, we also produce a social understanding of what that is. And cults are an effect of that social understanding. Cults are not a thing so much as a narrative, a story that is unleashed, sometimes unwittingly, the minute we hear the word. When we hear the word, we think immediately, one, some spectacular, remarkable, seemingly too good to be true thing, usually with a charismatic leader who imagines themselves a messiah or a truthsayer. People join this group. They are drawn in for reasons that may be sort of familiar, but are pulled more intensely than we can imagine for ourselves. When they enter this community, something happens to them. They're fundamentally transformed, maybe even rendered unrecognizable. They will claim to have found God, to experience bliss, to be saved, to be radically transformed. For those people on the outside, they're changed in other, far less celebratory ways. Then we believe that in a cult, there has to be a moment at which our social recognition of what it is not and the internal social recognition of what it is comes into a kind of conflict. That is, people are going to have to choose. Is this a thing that is worth believing in or not? In this crisis, there will be the advent of the true believer. And then there will be people who leave, sometimes of their own accord, sometimes by force. Thereafter, usually there's an additional conflict in which the cult is brought down. There's some spectacular scandal. That's the part we're most attuned to, because if you've watched any of the dozens of documentaries or listened to the podcasts, you know that they almost all begin at the end. They all start at the moment that is the object lesson against believing or wanting too much. It has to be the mass suicide, the disrobing of the Messiah, and the revelation that they're a con man. Followers who are so grief-stricken but are renouncing their faith. The story of the cult has to start at the end so we know how we're supposed to feel about everything that comes after. So every good, seemingly miraculous thing, everything that seems so impossible in our safe lives that we might be drawn to otherwise, we can only then see through the prism of the catastrophe to come. This suggests that the job of these narratives is to inoculate us against the power of these extreme beliefs. But I think actually something else is happening. We have to think about cults, their emergence, their rise and their transformation, not just as a matter of narrative or a matter of semantics, but also as a matter of history and culture. Our common conception of cults really has a particular historical birth. It is of the countercultural movement. The 1960s and 70s saw this boom of radical alternatives of thinking and living. Some of them came in socially recognized ways through, say, political protests, the free speech movement, protests for gay and lesbian rights, women's rights protests, anti-war protests. You also had these cultural movements like Woodstock and the rise of free love. This moment was a moment at which we saw this shift in what a generation of largely young, white, educated Americans thought it was possible to do and believe. This countercultural moment bears with it an anxiety that we have to really understand to understand cults. That is, of the Cold War. But when we talk about cults and what we fear, one of the things that we think about is this fear that people are transformed in such a radical way that the only way to understand this transformation is through brainwashing. The term brainwashing actually is coined in 1950 by a gonzo journalist and, frankly, a CIA asset who describes techniques of thought control employed by the Chinese Communist Party. But it doesn't become a feature of our public discourse until the 1962 film, The Manchurian Candidate, in which you have POWs who are returned seemingly the same, and yet have been programmed by their communist handlers to be sleeper agents. This fear that you might return soldiers who in their body look the same, but their minds have been somehow captured, is not also just a matter of television, because from 1953 on, the CIA was desperately studying techniques of mind control and persuasion as a way to understand what happens during war, but also to understand how to build a more docile and accepting public. This project starts in 1953, actually, with the Korean War Armistice Agreement, in which 21 American POWs refused to be repatriated. This caused an enormous crisis. What is it that happened to these soldiers that caused them to not want to come back to America, to want to stay in communist North Korea? The CIA uses this as a moment to start what will become a 2-decade-long project called MK Ultra, studying techniques of what they call brain warfare. At stake in those CIA experiments, in the Manchurian Candidate, and in a kind of public consternation around people who join cults, was about the future of America. The rise of communes and anti-establishment politics actually proved how close the communist threat was. That it was right there to invade vulnerable minds. Not just any vulnerable minds, the best minds of the time. Brainwashing suggests that the only way that people come to believe impossible things, for example, that the purpose of life is not entering into the capitalist workforce, marrying into a heterosexual dyad, buying a home and private property, and reproducing 2.1 children who will perfectly reproduce your life. That people would opt out of this vision ever is hard to imagine, but especially in this moment of post-war American prosperity. Here you had America announcing itself in the world as this new global presence. We have the rise of an American middle class, a growing educated populace through the GI Bill. You have the greatest vision of what we might call the American dream seemingly open to more and more people. This is the moment at which an American vision of capitalism should be at its absolute ascendance. And at that very moment, you have, again, bright, young, white, educated people saying, I prefer not to. How to not just understand that phenomenon, but rescue these young people and their minds and the future they represent from a communist threat becomes actually the matter of how we understand cults to begin with. There's maybe no more vivid example of this than the 1974 case of Patty Hearst, granddaughter of the publishing magnate William Randall Hearst, who was kidnapped from her Berkeley, California apartment by members of the Symbionese Liberation Army, which was a militant far-left group. As shocking as it was to have this young heiress kidnapped, what really captured an American audience were the images caught on CCTV of her armed with an automatic weapon, wearing a beret, robbing a bank. It was just terrifying for people to see what seemed to be this unthinkable transformation of one of the scions of American capitalism. At Hearst's trial for bank robbery, her family's enormous resources were brought to bear on her defense, and many mental health experts were brought in to explain how her mind had been transformed by her capture by this cult. No one was more compelling than Margaret Singer, a UC Berkeley sociolinguist, who actually testified at trial, though this would be stricken from the record later, that if Patty Hearst could be brainwashed and made to commit crimes by her captors, then anyone's child was at risk of being made into, quote, a low IQ, low affect zombie. That is, the threat that cults represent isn't contained to any individual group. It is the possibility that anyone's bright young child might be radically transformed, lost. So there's a pitched battle for the minds of cult devotees that pins itself to this fantasy that prior to joining this group, they were a person whose mind and desire and will were entirely their own and entirely socially recognized by everyone around them. There's this fantasy that the people who joined prior to being brainwashed were the successful, normal Americans. And so the project of returning them to themselves takes on this enormous cultural cachet, and it produces an enormous anxiety about what happens to people when they go into these groups and who they might be when they come out. The reason I point this out is because it is essential that we start to pull at the threads of that cult narrative that unfurls so unthinkingly to us to understand what about it hasn't actually been compelling enough. If the purpose of that story is to tell us that cults, that is, groups that disrupt our social equilibrium, promise what should be outside of the norms, that cults are a thing to be repudiated, that whatever they offer will never be balanced out by their cost, it is very clear that that kind of social inoculation isn't happening. And one place in which we might see its failure is in this story. The idea that prior to joining, people are happy, successful, and fully themselves. As we know, not only are most people who join cults not necessarily happy and successful and fully themselves, I dare say none of us are always happy, successful, and fully in charge of ourselves. When we prioritize this fantasy of a perfect prior moment, we suggest that leaving a cult should be the thing that everybody wants. That what a cult offers is the fantasy. What if I were to suggest instead the idea of this normal, satisfying life on the outside is the fantasy? That what drives the cultural zeitgeist around cults is the recognition that life on the outside, our everyday lives, the choices that we make in order to survive, to earn a wage, to be safe and secure in the world, does not lead to satisfaction. that people go to groups seeking what is missing in their lives, and when they find it, they're often loath to return to the other side. So we might then have to ask a different question. Not just why do people join cults, but why should people leave them? Not to say there aren't good reasons. Plenty of material harm happens in insular communities that get called cults. There's all kinds of exploitation that's possible. There's real violence. I'm not here to romanticize the actual bad things that happen in these groups that often get called cults. I am here to point out that when we ask people to leave communities that meet fundamental needs, if we do not have a way to meet those needs outside, in fact, if those needs are fundamentally incompatible with our lives outside, it's a losing battle. It's a losing battle that's not just about whether or not someone chooses to leave that cult. It's a losing battle of our own desire not to be ever more invested in what a cult might offer, even if we ourselves weren't going to join. So this is one way that we might think about this shift in how we feel about cults. The ways in which the preeminence of cults in our cultural imagination now continues to show us, of course, the tragedy and the hardship and the scandal and the violence, but also shows us remarkable forms of belonging and acceptance and salvation. Spending all that time with the positives, the people's true and fully felt experiences of transformation and love is compelling. And in being compelled, we're being changed. Let's think about why. Here's the truth. We're not in 1950s America. This is not the heyday of American prosperity and hope for the future. If you ask my students, if you ask a generation of young people coming of age who are bright and college educated, they do not feel themselves the inheritor of some great American prosperity. They are beset by climate change crisis, by the absolute decimation of the possibility of a middle class, debt immiseration, a real fear that there is no future for them. They comfort themselves in a kind of dark humor, a real love and romance of orcas that capsize yachts and claim that what we should be doing is eating the rich. This dark humor is a sign of a fundamental lack of hope about the future. These young people, who are the best and the brightest, don't even have the promise of the future of America that was offered to the countercultural generation to look forward to, so that they might even more deeply invest in the alternate possibilities offered by cults, even as they're only on their streaming devices, can't really come as that much of a surprise to us. So we are in a moment at which we as a society are more primed to think about radical alternatives, to think about opting out, to think about giving up on the safety of our everyday lives and trading it in for something else. And no moment more clearly showed us this than the 2020 pandemic lockdown. It was during this period that many people, like me, fell down cult rabbit holes, when everyday life was so disrupted that time was no longer on the 60-minute hour, but maybe was on the Netflix 55-minute episode. We were looking for all kinds of structure. We were looking for escape. And we found it. There was an absolute cottage industry that continues to boom to this day, worth several $1 billion, of documentaries and podcasts and narratives around cults. And as we watched, having been removed from our daily lives, our normal social interactions, so many of the things that make us who we are, we began to see the world and its possibilities differently. I certainly did. I found myself watching, for example, Wild Wild Country, a documentary about a yoga guru who goes and builds a commune in Oregon, and I found myself absolutely encaptured by the possibility of communal life. Forms of relationships and sociality and giving up the norm that I would otherwise step so far away from, I suddenly began to think made a lot of sense. And I wasn't alone. I was a part of an enormous cultural shift in which cults began to be the currency of our everyday lives. So it's not as though I was simply watching and sitting by myself. I was watching often in concert with other people, timing it so we would stream at the same time, as though we could be in the same room. And as we watched, we would talk about how these seemingly strange ideas didn't seem so strange. We started to collectively imagine whether we could live and believe in other ways. What seemed at first like escapism began to be a world. We began to inhabit a world together, a world in which the thing that gets called a cult isn't the thing to fear, but maybe the thing that opens a door we thought was locked, a door if we walked through we would be happier and more fulfilled from. So this shift towards an absolute immersion in the narrative of cults, in which, in their carefully, kind of deliciously paced slowness of 6 to 12 episodes, we got to see so much and hear so much and feel as though we were almost there. Our own conceptions of the possible began to shift. Now, cults don't emerge out of nowhere, and cult media borrows deeply from the playbook of true crime on the one hand, this idea that you can watch and become the kind of perfect detective. You can solve the crime and never be the victim. Cult documentaries also suggest you can be fully immersed, know the secret, feel the transformation and some of the joy, but not yourself be changed. The other thing that cult documentaries lean heavily on is high production values. The world of prestige TV, which brought serial killers and mobsters and hateful tycoons into our lives, then Succession and Dexter and The Sopranos, radically shifted what it was good culture to love. Who would have known that talking about how sympathetic a serial killer was, or learning to love a mobster, would be the stuff that you wanted to talk to your coworkers about at the water cooler? And not just because you were interested, but because it was a sign of being a particular kind of person. Prestige TV primes an audience that imagines itself very smart, real consumers of beautiful objects. And so when cult documentaries borrow from that glossiness, they do a similar work of inviting us to admit that what would otherwise be unthinkable to feel positive about or identify with can actually be a sign of how smart we are, how cultured we are. This shift has meant that we are no longer who we used to be. There is no going back to a moment at which the word cult singularly produces a kind of social repression. There is no going back to a moment at which the word cult is a duck and cover sign. Cults are, at the very least now, a recognition of what is missing in our everyday lives. They may still be warnings against seeking out too much. They may still be warnings against the overreaches of individual power, but they are no longer the thing from which we can claim to avert our eyes. By installing them on our streaming devices, in our ears, on our phones, we've installed them in our psyches. We've become radically transformed in the landscape of what it is possible to want and the ends to which we might go to get it. So I'll ask you, are you sure you don't want to join a cult?
Poulomi, thank you so much for that. That was fantastic. It really challenged a lot of my views on cults in the media. As someone who also dug into cult documentaries at the same time you did, especially with Wild Wild Country, I've thought about this topic a lot too, and especially around Wild Wild Country. But there's other ones like Keep Sweet about Warren Jeffs. One of the biggest things I sort of see in common with these cults is that they're all American. Am I just seeing American cult media because that's where I live and that's what Netflix feeds me, or are cults sort of a particularly American phenomenon?
That's a great question. I believe that they're an American phenomenon. Singularly American, perhaps not, but there are really good and important reasons why cults flourish in America. One of the reasons is because of America's twinned relationship to capitalism. The birth of America as a settler colonial state is twinned to the rise of modern capitalism, which means that an American psyche and an American state is formed around a set of ideals. You know them: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These are the things that make an American. What they suggest is that every American is this individual, hyper-contained subject in control of themselves, whose single job it really is to make money and to give money to the next generation. Right? This is the American dream. It's an unromantic vision of it, but that fixation on the individual and private property is, I think, a particularly American fixation. There are countries that have moved in that model, but almost every other has a more complicated origin story. America is a kind of extraordinary example of the nation state. And so when you have 250 years of this as the kind of culture of what you have to do and who you have to be, it's not that surprising that you make room for these radical alternatives. The other thing that this does, this fixation on individualism and private property, is it has kept America, I think, in large part, though not true in all communities, it's kept America from establishing what anthropologists would call high social cohesion. What that basically means is what keeps you in the world. Americans report higher rates of loneliness and feelings of isolation than any other country on earth. And I think that comes from the fact that there has never really been a commitment to the production of a kind of socially cohesive body. You have friends, you have neighborhoods, you have families, but where in many other countries and cultures, high social cohesion is what holds you in place. You have commitments to people that you don't know. You have a sense of an identity that is larger than you and inextricable. American individualism is like, go be you. Being you is lonely. Being you is hard sometimes. And so I think that this really does prime a particular kind of hunger and a kind of desperation that then communities that will offer high social cohesion speak to. You know, it's telling to me that the other place that we've recently seen a rise in cults, the two other places are Japan and Korea. Also, two recently hyper-industrialized countries that are seeing, and academics are studying this, a degradation of social cohesion. What used to be strong community structures are falling apart. Families are becoming more nuclear, and you have more and more people who feel as though they might just fall out of the world. And that feeling of, I could fall out of the world, I think, is for many people ontologically terrifying. I mean, it should be. And so if you have a way to keep yourself so firmly in the world, why wouldn't you take it?
That's interesting. And I guess in thinking about maybe in looking at the cult media that I've consumed and the bad actors, let's say, whether they were well-intentioned or forthright at all, it also just sort of pairs with, I don't know, this like snake oil salesman opportunity that is prevalent in American, history and everything. Can you sort of elaborate on how you've been able to tease out the difference between, let's say, a salacious voyeurism of cult media and a genuine interest in what those cults or what cults in general have to offer? Because to me, sometimes it feels like, we may have just, everybody maybe consumed Wild Wild Country. Netflix execs were like, hey, this is going great. Let's green light 10 more cult documentaries. And then we were fed that. And then it becomes this like loop, where Netflix is sort of driving culture. Like, do you know whether that's the case or not, and how you separate whether we're genuinely consuming these with an interest, or is it the like sex and violence leads and sells,
You have identified, I think, the perfect parallel of these structures. Part of what I'm really invested in is, one, depathologizing how we think of cults. Not because I want to romanticize them, but because I think we need to think about how people act towards their own desires. So that for me has meant disaggregating what a purported leader does and says and believes from the effect of being with other believers for a believer. That is, there are messiahs and gurus and leaders who probably have very good intentions. But we have at least as many examples of people who understand that they can run a con, right? This is a common story we have about cults. Just because they think they're running a con doesn't mean their effect is a con. Their believers do feel loved and saved. People write to me every day to tell me their stories about having been in groups, having left them sometimes with enormous grief because they recognize that they're walking away from an experience so profound and fulfilling, and they know that they are not going to find it again. What happens to believers is something really different than what a cult leader wants or thinks. And so much of our historical interest has been on the cult leader. Let's talk about Charles Manson or Jim Jones, Marshall Applewhite, that we can only then imagine their followers as dupes, as sheeple. They're there just blindly following this charismatic person with inordinate power. I think that is a misreading. I think people act towards their own desires. Sometimes those desires are ugly. Sometimes those desires are deeply uncomfortable and disruptive, but people do what they need and they find enormous meaning. Similarly, when we watch cult documentaries, I think we can avow that there is a economic impulse now to produce cult media. It just now, like every week, there's a new docuseries that drops. They're going to start having to invent cults, I think, to keep feeding this machine. But what that media ends up representing, I think, does actually often awaken things in the audience that are real. It strikes at places at which maybe we didn't even know we were vulnerable. Because I think we've all had that experience of watching something, arms tightly crossed over us, sure that we're shielding ourselves from that strange, weird, bad thing. And there's something that you're like, oh, I feel moved. Oh, that's me. That could have been me. Could that be me? That experience is real and transformative, and I want to take it seriously. We would be wrong to just think that we're passive dupes consuming the culture we're being fed. I think actually we're savvier than the media gives us credit for, and people are acting towards desire, again, in difficult ways.
Yeah, interesting. It's interesting that you mentioned getting emails from folks who have been part of those communities or still are. Can you talk a little bit about like the prevalence of cults today and what that looks like? Because I think still after this talk, the image that I have in my head is still, you know, Jonestown, Waco, you know, those kinds of things. So I'm hoping to have maybe a different image of it.
I don't know if cults are more prevalent or not. Every so often, someone will ask me how many cults exist, and I don't know how we would even begin to count. But I do think that we're in a moment where people see that radical alternatives are possible again. And I think that part of the reason that people reach out to me is because I have a rather unique cult perspective as people who are in this field go. Almost to a person, and I think of Margaret Singer, my now posthumous Berkeley colleague, as a kind of interesting ancestor, though to this project. Her entire life's work was about, and she was very committed to this idea that she was going to free people from the shackles of having been programmed and brainwashed by a cult. And I think that when people hear me say that I believe that people experience extraordinary transformative things and that they're moved and that the choice to leave or stay is not an easy one, and that they're not crazy or dupes or in need of repair, people feel able to then talk about all the things they seek and where they go seeking them. So I have lots of people write to me and say, I was in this group that everyone called a cult. I left. It was very hard. And sometimes they'll say, thankfully, I've discovered yoga. So, and I don't want to be in the business of diagnosing a cult or a cultic attachment, but it is striking to me how often people go from one insular, highly accepting community to another.
Can you give us a good definition of cults in the very beginning of your talk, and I'm just sort of curious to know, like, as the term has become more popularized and it's blurring in a new direction from what we know before, can you talk about some of the differences between or among, let's say, a religion and a populist political movement and a cult? Like, what are the sociological differences, but also, like, does the government label them differently, you know?
Yes. This is my now ongoing tagline in my work, that there is a single arbiter of religion in America. And in some ways, that becomes the arbiter of a cult, right? Something that is pushed out of the definition of religion is often accused of being a cult. And that arbiter, do you know who it is?
No.
Who decides what makes a cult in America?
No.
It's the IRS.
Okay.
The Internal Revenue Service is the single organization that gets to legally determine whether something is a religion, because churches seek tax-exempt status through the IRS. So there is an arbiter that doesn't really help us understand cults in the world. And the term is used pretty willy-nilly. I think a lot of people want to know if the thing they're looking at is a cult. And when they ask me that, I usually say two things. One, if you're asking the question, you've identified something that has triggered this story that you have about what a cult is. So let's try and figure out what that thing is that started that story. Is it the charismatic leader? Is it the followers who seem just absolutely besotted? Is it my inability to have any understanding of the reality that they inhabit? Those are often for us keywords of a cult. For me, it is less important to identify this or that as a cult than to say that in groups that take on this name, there are often lots of dynamics that emerge. And the one that we really need to keep our eye to is not the promise of prosperity or salvation, but material harm. That is, it's more important to identify when groups, by virtue of being insular and driven towards a single goal or following the instructions of a single charismatic figure, when those groups make for things like exploitation and violence, then we need to think about the problem. If it just makes you feel funny, I am not convinced that that is enough for us to somehow start to pathologize it. This is what I mean when I want to move away from the pathology of the cult, is when we are so quick to say that's a cult, it must be bad, we assume that bad just means not normal. I think we need to think about bad as being material harm, as being real risks to people, not just a risk to what I think someone else should do or be.
Yeah, yeah. When I think there's a podcast, and I forget the name of it, but there's a podcast that talks about like, is blank a cult? And it looks at stuff through, is my Starbucks subscription a cult, or is SoulCycle a cult? Do those conversations in like the popular media to you sort of cheapen what it means to like actually look at what a cult is and the alternative lifestyle it can offer?
Well, Amanda Montell has this excellent book called Cultish, in which she identifies how there's a particular kind of language to what we call cults, a way of talking about belonging, but also talking about disbelief. And her objects include things like SoulCycle, right? Like how you get people to be hyper invested. I think this is still part of a long history of trying to show all the things that are wrong with these groups that disrupt our social equilibrium. So when people ask, is that a cult? Often they're asking, why can't I live the way I want? That's a really important question for us to reckon with. Often the identification of a cult is this realization that we make all of these decisions to keep ourselves safe within normal life. And when you see someone acting so far outside that, one, I think you wonder, why not me? And two, and this is a real, I think, psychological effect, you want them to suffer. You want something bad to happen. This is part of the satisfaction of cult documentaries. They start with the bad thing. Someone's going to suffer. You should regret ever believing you could have it all. You should regret that moment at which you had this kind of excess of possibility. I think we see it in the political arena around things like what gets called the cult of MAGA, and opponents who desperately want to see not just the end of a particular kind of political ascendancy, but they want to see the broken followers who say, I was wrong, I was brainwashed, take me back. That perspective is going to produce, I think, impossible futures. I see no real future in which, one, anyone gets that satisfaction, but two, where that satisfaction leads to anything good. I don't think we move to a state, let's say, of higher social cohesion, where fewer people feel as though they might fall out of the world, if what we need first to return to this world is people crawling on their hands and knees on broken glass.
Poulomi, there's a Discovery Channel show called The Garden, Cult or Commune, where it sort of looks at people who join, and I guess maybe it's up to the audience whether this is a cult or a commune. Can you sort of talk about that? And like, that seems like a very new show, and sort of what that says about our place in the like cult zeitgeist right now?
Absolutely. It's always nice as an academic to have the real world supply the validation to a theory. So for a long time, I've been theorizing that we have been radically changed by our cult obsession. And lo and behold, last year, here comes the garden cult or commune on TV, proving my point. So it's remarkable because it is a documentary, but it's not a cult documentary in the Netflix form. It's actually a cult documentary meets Survivor. It's a reality TV show in which the garden, which is an established off-grid community, invited through TikTok people to come and try it out and themselves be tried out by the community. And so the series follows 6 people who travel to, I think, rural Tennessee and see if they want to join this community. At the end of the 2-week trial, there is a tribal council like in Survivor, and they're kind of invited to stay or cast out if they don't leave before. And the question is posed to the contestants whether or not it's a cult or commune. Now, unsurprisingly, the people who stay, who want to stay, say it's a commune. The people who leave, whether they feel they can't live off grid or there are too many rules or too few rules, say it's a cult. What's really interesting to me is the idea that we've moved to reality TV and to the game show, that there is this way in which, one, we assume a kind of fluency with what a cult is, how to identify it, but also that people have watched so much cult media that they think they can kind of game the system. And I will say, not to spoil it for viewers, I hope you go and watch it, what actually unfolds is so much more complicated. It really becomes a kind of microcosm of society in unexpected ways. And I found it incredibly moving, though I will admit I was chilled by the idea that there will be a season 2. That there's something that's really shifted in our story about cults, about what we might do, whether or not we leave our houses to go try them out, that I think proves that the landscape beneath our feet has drastically changed.
Do you see it as like a warning sign that as you referenced earlier in your talk, sort of the disaffected nature of young college kids and trending towards more and more loneliness and isolation in the United States? Like, are we going to see an uptick in these alternative communities, let's say?
I would guess that we will see them. I mean, I very routinely get emails and phone calls from journalists who are investigating a thing that they want to know. 1, is it a cult? And will I tell them whether or not it is a cult? And 2, whether or not this is a part of a broader systemic move. I think it is. I think that part of what post-pandemic life, the hyper-partisanship, the growing fascism have wrought is people now saying, I don't like living this way. And people willing to risk those lives to find something else. It's also worth pointing out how many of these visions are prepper communes or kind of tech utopia style communal living. So you have on the one hand the promise of some catastrophic end that some people are particularly well equipped to survive, or the technocratic vision that a small group of people will build a better world as the rest of it burns. Neither of those seems to me the solution. I think neither of those is a systematic way to think about things like disaffection and loneliness and absolute pessimism. So I'm not going to endorse them as the solution, but I do think it's not a coincidence, and I think that people are compelled, and we will see more people willing to step out of the norm as the norm continues to narrow in its ability to give us what we need.
Yeah. Oh man, those feel like such a shitty 21st century response to like 60s counterculture, free love movements,
I have hope though. I will say I teach this cults class, and I've had thousands of students, and one of the things they do at the end of the class, which you may know, is they work in these intentional communities all semester, and then they design one at the end. And they're terrifyingly good. They're terrifying in how well they're able to identify unmet needs in their own lives and to imagine truly compelling solutions. There are actually terrifying versions of them, but I will say that what I am constantly reminded of as, they present them is that our students have a remarkable capacity to eschew standard given truths and to build better paths. And I think, frankly, my students are kinder and more compassionate and more committed to one another than I've ever seen. So I think there is actually a kind of lived alternative formed in this generation of young thinkers. I think that they're not going to necessarily all follow the tech utopia or garden model. And I hope that they actually enact more radical and egalitarian visions that they might find livable and a place where they can thrive.